The knife pressed deeper into Eleanor's throat, drawing a thin line of blood that trickled down her collarbone. Victor Romano's breath reeked of whiskey and cruelty as he leaned in close, his scarred face inches from hers. "You think you're a hero, street rat?" He laughed, the sound like shattering glass against concrete. "You're nothing, just another piece of garbage I'm about to throw away." Behind Victor, 3 of his Salvatore soldiers held the trembling 10-year-old boy in a chokehold. Ethan's gray eyes, so much like his father's, were wide with terror, locked onto Eleanor's face. He'd stopped screaming. Now he just watched this gaunt, hollow-cheeked woman in torn clothes who'd thrown herself between him and monsters. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her wooden stick, her only weapon, her only friend. The hickory was slick with her own blood, the fabric-wrapped handle soaked through. She could taste copper on her tongue, her vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in, but she didn't let go. "Get your hands off the boy!" Eleanor's voice came out as a rasp, barely louder than a whisper, but sharp as broken bone. "Walk away." In the distance, growing louder like approaching thunder, came the unmistakable roar of engines. Not motorcycles, something far more dangerous. A convoy of black Mercedes Maybachs, their headlights cutting through the Chicago dusk like predator eyes, dozens of them. Victor's smile faltered. He had no idea what he'd just started. He had no idea whose son he'd tried to take, and he had absolutely no idea that the skinny, blood-soaked woman gasping for air on the pavement was about to become the most protected person in Chicago's criminal underworld, a living legend who'd earn her place in the Ashford Syndicate with nothing but a wooden stick and a refusal to die. 12 hours earlier, Eleanor Brennan had been nobody. If you want to know how a homeless woman with a wooden stick brought the most powerful Mafia empire to its knees, hit that like button and subscribe to follow this story. Share it with someone who loves a good underdog tale. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when Jonathan Ashford finally sees the woman who saved his son's life. 12 hours earlier, the first light of Chicago slipped through the cracked seams of a 1992 Toyota Camry, where Eleanor Brennan opened her eyes to the dull ache running along her spine. The abandoned car beneath the I-90 overpass had been her home for the past 3 weeks, far better than a park bench or a shop awning. At least it had 4 walls and a lock that still worked. She pushed herself upright, her bones cracking like those of an old woman even though she was only 27. 9 years on the streets had taken many things from her, and youth was only one of them. Eleanor slid out of the car and drew in a breath of cold October air heavy with the smell of diesel smoke and rotting trash. She stretched, feeling every muscle pulled tight after a night curled into the back seat. Then she reached for the one thing that never left her side, a hickory stick nearly a meter long, wrapped with old cloth around the grip. She had found it at a demolition site on the south side 2 years earlier. Nothing more than a discarded piece of wood, but she had spent 3 weeks sanding every edge smooth, adjusting the balance, wrapping strips torn from a ruined t-shirt so her hand wouldn't slip when sweat came. It wasn't a weapon by any legal definition, just a piece of wood. But in Eleanor's hands, it was the only thing standing between her and a world that wanted to swallow her whole. She walked 4 blocks to the alley behind Sal's Pizza, where she trained every morning before the city woke up. Filthy trash bins became her targets. 50 slashes, 50 blocks, 50 thrusts. Her arms burned by the end. Her shoulders felt as if they might tear free, but pain was only weakness leaving the body. She had learned everything from YouTube videos watched at the public library. No money for martial arts classes, no teacher, only survival instinct and the stubborn endurance of someone who had nothing left to lose. "What the hell are you training for?" A gravelly voice rose from the mouth of the alley. Eleanor spun, stick raised, then lowered it when she recognized Carl. 60 years old, a Vietnam veteran, his gray beard wild, his blue eyes clouded like frosted glass. He lived in an abandoned shipping container 2 blocks away. "Just exercising, Carl. You should get some more sleep." Carl spat onto the ground and shook his head. "You shouldn't be in this area." She frowned. "Why, Salvatore?" Carl spoke the name the way someone spoke of a disease. "They're expanding their territory. Last week, they beat a kid just for selling drugs without permission. Beat him so bad he's eating through a tube now. You're a woman, alone, with no one backing you. They won't leave you alone." Eleanor tightened her grip on the stick. "I can take care of myself." Carl looked at her with the eyes of a man who had seen too much death to be afraid anymore. "Everyone thinks that, until they can't. Be careful, girl." Then he turned away, shuffling off like a ghost from another time. Eleanor watched him go, then turned back to her training. She had no other choice. This was the territory where she could exist without being harassed, at least for now. Salvatore or anyone else. She had survived 9 years on the streets of Chicago. She wouldn't run just because of a name. Eleanor left the alley after the sun had climbed high, the stick slung across her shoulder like a farmer carrying a hoe. She headed toward the Harold Washington Public Library, where there was free Wi-Fi and clean restrooms, where she could wash her face. The route took her past Lincoln Elementary School just as the dismissal bell rang. She stopped. Children poured out through the gates like birds released from a cage, backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, bright laughter tearing through the cold air. Some ran into their mother's arms, some climbed into their father's cars, some held their grandmother's hands and walked home. Eleanor stood across the street, watching a scene so ordinary it felt cruel, and a cold that had nothing to do with the weather spread through her chest. She saw a blonde girl run out, about 7 or 8 years old, grinning wide when she spotted the person waiting for her. And suddenly Eleanor was no longer in Chicago. She was in Naperville, 9 years earlier, inside a 2-story house with a white fence and an artificially perfect garden. Molly had hair just like that. Her foster sister, 8 years old, eyes blue as a summer sky, who loved to weave dandelion crowns and wear them like a princess. Molly loved to sing, especially a song about sunshine that she sang every morning when she woke up, her voice clear as wind chimes. Eleanor was 17 when she was placed with the Cole family, the final placement before she aged out of the system. Richard Cole was a successful businessman, his wife a piano teacher, the house always spotless, and the refrigerator always full. On paper, it was a perfect family, but Eleanor had lived long enough in the system to know that paper could lie. She saw it in the first week. The way Richard Cole looked at Molly when his wife wasn't paying attention. The excuses he made to be alone with the child in a room. The way Molly shrank whenever she heard his footsteps in the hallway. Eleanor reported it. She called DCFS and told them everything she saw, everything she suspected. A social worker came, looked at the immaculate house, looked at Richard Cole in his expensive suit with a trustworthy smile, looked at Molly sitting silently beside him, then wrote in the report that there was no evidence of abuse. Richard Cole was respected in the community, a donor to the church, a sponsor of the school. Eleanor was just an orphan, with a thick file of failed placements. No one believed her. 1 week after the report, Eleanor came home from school to find an ambulance parked outside. She ran into the house, ran up the stairs, ran into the bathroom. Molly lay in the tub, the water long gone cold, her skin waxy and pale, an empty bottle of Ambien on the floor. 8 years old. An 8-year-old child had decided that death was kinder than living. Richard Cole stood in the hallway, his face drained of color, telling the police that Molly was depressed, that doctors had warned them. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. No one was charged. No one was investigated. Molly was buried in a small suburban cemetery, and the world kept turning as if nothing had happened. Eleanor ran away that night. She couldn't stay in that house another second, couldn't look at Richard Cole without wanting to kill him. She climbed out a window with a backpack of clothes and $40 in savings, and she never went back. 9 years on the streets had taught her many things, but there was one lesson she taught herself on the first night she slept under an overpass. She swore. She swore to Molly's ghost. She swore to herself that if she ever saw a child in danger, she wouldn't wait for adults to help. She wouldn't trust the system. She would protect them with her own hands, even if it cost her life. The hickory stick was her oath, her atonement, the only purpose that still made her want to wake up each morning. The school bell rang again, pulling Eleanor back to the present. The blonde girl was gone, the yard empty. Eleanor took a deep breath, pressed the pain down where it had always lived just beneath her breastbone, and kept walking. Eleanor left the library in the middle of the afternoon, after washing her face in the restroom, and spending 2 hours reading the news on a public computer. She had no specific destination, only walking to kill time before night fell, and she had to return to the Toyota beneath the overpass. Her feet unconsciously carried her north, through streets that grew cleaner, buildings that rose taller, cars parked along the curb that became steadily more expensive. The Gold Coast, the wealthiest district in Chicago, where historic mansions stood beside penthouse towers, where a single dinner cost as much as Eleanor lived on for an entire month. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. People on the sidewalk looked at her with an expression she knew too well, a mix of disgust and fear, as if her poverty were something contagious. She should have turned back, but something held her in place. An ice cream truck was parked on the corner, the old-fashioned kind with cheerful music and a menu painted on its side. Standing in front of it was a boy around 10 years old, wearing the uniform of the Francis Parker School, the kind of uniform where just the jacket cost more than everything Eleanor owned combined. He bounced lightly on his heels while waiting for his ice cream, a Toomey backpack slung over one shoulder. Beside him stood a large man in a black suit, shoulders as wide as a doorway, eyes hidden behind sunglasses even though the afternoon was already fading. A bodyguard. Eleanor recognized it instantly. She had seen enough people on the streets to know the difference. This wasn't an ordinary child walking home from school. This was someone's son, someone important, someone rich, someone dangerous enough to require protection, 24/7. She should have walked away. Not her business. Nothing to do with her. Then she saw the van. A newer model Chevy Express, black, windows tinted so dark the inside was invisible. It was parked across the street, about 30 feet from the ice cream truck, the engine still running. Exhaust drifted faintly into the cold air. Eleanor glanced at the clock on the bank sign across the street. Then she looked at the van. Then, back at the clock. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The van didn't move. The driver didn't get out. No one stepped out. It just sat there, engine running, like an animal waiting to strike. 9 years on the streets had taught Eleanor one thing. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Her survival instinct, the thing that had kept her alive through countless dangerous nights, was screaming inside her head. She knew this feeling. She had seen this pattern before. Not exactly the same, but close enough to recognize it. A predator waiting for the moment. A guard growing careless. A target unaware. The boy took his ice cream from the vendor, grinning, said something to the bodyguard. The big man nodded, one hand holding his own ice cream, the other checking his phone. Distracted. Only a second of distraction, but a second was enough. Eleanor slowed, then stopped completely. She sat down on a bench about 30 feet from the truck, laying the stick across her thighs. She pulled out the cracked screen iPhone she had fished from a trash bin the month before, pretending to scroll as if absorbed in something else. But her eyes never left the black van. She didn't know who the boy was. She didn't know who the bodyguard was. She didn't know who the van belonged to. But she knew one thing for certain. If anything happened to that child, she wouldn't stand by and watch. Not this time. Never again. The boy and the bodyguard started walking toward the black SUV parked at the curb about 20 feet from the ice cream truck. The boy licked his ice cream as he walked, carefree like any 10-year-old. The bodyguard Derek moved beside him, still looking at his phone. A mistake that would cost him dearly. Eleanor saw the van's sliding door open before she heard a sound. Everything happened in seconds, but to her it unfolded in slow motion, each moment carved into her vision like a blade cutting into stone. 3 men burst from the van like a sprung trap. Black ski masks, rough fabric with holes cut for eyes and mouth. The first carried a Taser X-26, the professional police-grade model. The second held a Glock 19, dark metal cold in the afternoon light. The third carried a black cloth bag, the kind used to hood hostages. They moved with the precision of a trained unit. No wasted words, no wasted motion. Derek looked up from his phone, his hand reaching toward his waist where his gun was concealed. But the man with the taser was faster. 2 prongs fired, embedding in Derek's chest, and 50,000 volts tore through his body. Derek collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, convulsing on the sidewalk as ice cream splattered everywhere. The boy screamed, a piercing sound filled with terror, the scream of a child who didn't understand why the world had suddenly turned into hell. Eleanor didn't think. 9 years on the streets had taught her one thing: thinking gets you killed. She charged across the street like a bullet leaving the barrel, the hickory stick in her hand, her boots pounding the asphalt. 30 feet vanished in an instant. The man with the cloth bag reached for the boy, his fingers inches from the child's shoulder. Eleanor swung the stick in a perfect arc, all her strength focused into his wrist. The sound of breaking bone was like a dry branch snapping. He howled. The bag fell to the ground, his arm hanging at an impossible angle. The man with the Glock spun around, eyes wide behind the mask. Eleanor was already within striking range. She gave him no chance to aim. The stick swept low, smashing into his knee with a sharp crack. He pitched forward onto his face, the gun flying from his hand and skidding across the pavement. 2 men. She had dropped 2 men in less than 3 seconds. But the third, the one with the taser, was faster than she expected. He didn't attack head-on. He came from behind, from her blind spot. A hand seized Eleanor's hair and yanked her head back with brutal force. She lost her balance, her throat exposed. Then she felt it. Cold steel pressed against her neck just beneath her chin, just above the carotid artery. The attacker dragged her toward a nearby dark alley, out of the street's view, one hand still tangled in her hair, the other holding a 7-inch blade steady like a surgeon's tool. The two accomplices, despite their pain, forced themselves up, one limping with a shattered knee, the other clutching his useless wrist, and they grabbed the boy. Ethan was still screaming, struggling, but adult hands were too strong. They hauled him into the alley along with Eleanor. Darkness swallowed them. Eleanor felt her back slam against damp brick, the stench of rot and urine flooding her senses. The man holding her loosened his grip on her hair, but never moved the knife from her throat. For the first time, she saw his face clearly as he pulled down the mask. A scarred face, a long cut running from the corner of his left eye down to his chin, as if someone had tried to split his face in two. His eyes were cold like dead fish. His breath reeked of whiskey. "What the hell are you?" he asked, his voice rough like stones grinding together. Eleanor didn't answer. Her hand still clenched the stick, even as blood from the cut on her neck began to slide down toward her collarbone. Victor Romano. That was the name Eleanor would never forget, even though at this moment she didn't yet know who he was. He tilted his head as he studied her the way a collector examined a strange insect. Curiosity mixed with contempt. "You broke Rico's arm and smashed Sal's knee with just this stick?" His gaze dropped to the hickory in her hand. "Impressive. For a sewer rat." She didn't answer. Her eyes searched for an exit, calculating distances, assessing the positions of the two remaining men holding Ethan. Victor didn't like silence. He didn't like being ignored. The blade slid from her neck down her left arm, and he cut. Not deep enough to be lethal, but deep enough to draw blood, painful enough to make most people scream. Eleanor didn't scream. Her teeth clenched, her jaw locked, but she denied him that satisfaction. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Stubborn. I like that." He cut again, this time into her right side, through the thin fabric, into skin and flesh. Eleanor felt warm blood spill down her hip, soaking into her waistband. Her vision blurred for a heartbeat, but she forced herself to focus. "Look at the torturer. Don't look away. Don't show weakness. Who hired you?" Victor demanded. "Who do you work for? Ashford? Chen? Or those Bratva bastards?" Eleanor still said nothing. She didn't know those names. She didn't know whose war she had stumbled into. She only knew a child needed saving, and she had acted. Victor lost patience. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to face him. "I'll ask one more time. Who are you?" Eleanor stared at him, at the dead fish eyes, at the long scar, at the cruelty etched into every line of his face. Then she spat. Blood and saliva splashed across the center of Victor's face. He froze for a second, unable to believe what had just happened. Then he roared and drove his fist into her stomach. Eleanor doubled over, bile burning up her throat, but she didn't fall. She refused to fall. From the corner of her eye, she saw Ethan watching her. The boy had stopped screaming long ago. Now he just stared, gray eyes wide, not with fear anymore, but with something else, as if he were seeing something he had never seen before. A stranger, a homeless woman, enduring torture for him, no connection, no reason, only because he was a child and she was someone willing to die to protect a child. Eleanor looked back at Ethan. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. She tried to send a wordless message. "Don't be afraid. It'll be okay." Even though she wasn't sure that was true. Victor grabbed her hair again, yanking her head back. "Enough. I don't have time to play with you. Deal with this crazy bitch, then get the kid in the car." This was her only chance. Eleanor gathered every shred of strength she had left, all the pain, all the rage, and slammed her head backward. Her forehead crashed into Victor's nose with everything she could muster. The crack of breaking bones sounded like a firecracker. Victor howled, dropping the knife, clutching his face as blood poured through his fingers. Eleanor collapsed to the ground, trying to crawl toward Ethan, but her body no longer obeyed. Too much blood lost, too much pain. "You bastard," Victor screamed, his voice warped by blood. "Kill her. Kill that whore right now." The two remaining men released Ethan and lunged for the gun lying on the ground. Eleanor tried to stand, but her legs felt like cotton. She could only watch, helpless, as they picked up the Glock, as the barrel swung toward her. Then she heard engines. Not ordinary engines. The roar of V12 power, heavy and threatening like rolling thunder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Black Mercedes Maybach S. 680 vehicles sealed the mouth of the alley like a wall of steel. Headlights tore through the darkness, flooding the attackers with a judgmental glare. Doors opened in unison. 12 men in black suits poured out, Sig Sauer P.226 6 pistols in hand, muzzles trained on Victor and his crew. But Eleanor didn't look at them. She looked at the man who stepped out of the center car, over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, a perfectly tailored black 3-piece Tom Ford suit, black hair threaded with early silver at the temples, and a diagonal scar running from his left cheekbone down to his chin, as if someone had tried to map suffering across his face. But what held Eleanor's gaze were his eyes, gray like a Chicago winter sky, cold as steel, and burning with a fury she had never seen in another human being. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He simply walked forward, each step measured, like death coming to collect souls. Then he raised his gun and fired. One shot. Victor went down, hit in the shoulder, screaming in agony. The other 2 dropped to their knees, hands raised, weapons clattering to the ground. The man went straight to Ethan, knelt, and pulled the boy into his arms. "Are you hurt?" His voice, the first time Eleanor heard it, was no longer steel. It trembled. It broke at the edges. "I'm okay, Dad," the boy whispered, face buried against his father's shoulder. "She saved me." The man stood, Ethan still held close, and looked toward Eleanor. For the first time, he truly looked at her, at the gaunt woman in torn clothes, soaked in blood, struggling to stand with a wooden stick like a final crutch. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice like steel slicing glass. Eleanor looked at him, at the empire behind him, at the power and wealth and authority she could never touch. "Nobody," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. Then her knees buckled, and the world slipped into darkness. The first thing Eleanor noticed when she woke was softness. Sheets so soft she didn't believe fabric could feel like this. The air didn't smell of trash or urine or diesel smoke, but of faint lavender, clean linen, and money. She opened her eyes and didn't recognize where she was. The ceiling rose high above her, crowned with a crystal chandelier. The walls were painted a pale cream, hung with paintings that looked more expensive than the car she had once lived in. Tall windows overlooked a lush green garden, and beyond it, a lake glittered in the afternoon light. Eleanor tried to sit up and pain ripped through her like lightning. Her right side, her left arm, her neck, every place Victor had cut, screamed in protest. She looked down and saw white bandages wrapped around her body, a silk nightgown replacing the blood-soaked rags she'd worn before. Panic surged. "I'd advise you to stay still." The voice came from the corner of the room. Eleanor turned her head, instinctively searching for a weapon, and saw an older man sitting in a chair by the window. 60 or older, silver hair neatly trimmed, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, reading glasses hanging from his neck. He carried himself like someone who had once worn a uniform, straight-backed, broad-shouldered, eyes calm. "I'm Dr. Samuel Hartley," he said, his voice low and even. "You were unconscious for 48 hours. 17 stitches, 2 cracked ribs, about a liter of blood lost. You're lucky to be alive." "Where am I?" Eleanor asked, her voice hoarse with dryness. "Ashford Estate." "Winnetka. You're a guest of Mr. Jonathan Ashford." Eleanor didn't know the name, but she knew Winnetka, the North Shore, the wealthiest stretch around Chicago, a place people like her were never meant to enter, let alone lie in a silk bed. "Where's my stick?" she asked. Dr. Hartley gestured toward the corner of the room. The hickory stick lay there, cleaned of blood, placed on a piece of velvet like a museum artifact. Eleanor let out a breath, a small measure of relief. At least she still had something that was hers. "I need to go," she said, trying to push the covers aside. She looked back, refusing to lower her gaze, refusing to appear weak even as every part of her body screamed in pain. "Eleanor Brennan," he finally said, his voice like steel scraping stone. 27 years old. Foster care until 18. No permanent address. No bank account. 2 arrests for vagrancy. Released due to overcrowding. Last recorded employment. Dishwasher at a Denny's in Cicero 3 years ago. Quit after 2 weeks. You investigated me. Not a question. I investigate everyone who comes into contact with my son. He placed a file on the table beside her bed. But this file doesn't explain why a homeless woman would risk her life to save a child she didn't know. Children don't need reasons to be protected. Jonathan studied her for another moment, as if reading pages she didn't know she'd written. Then he spoke again. "The men who attacked my son belong to the Salvatore family. My enemies, You ruined a kidnapping worth millions in ransom. Sorry for the inconvenience to your war, Eleanor said. Her tone edged with irony despite lying still with 17 stitches in her body. Jonathan didn't smile, but something shifted in his eyes, as if she'd said something he hadn't expected. You have 2 options, he said, his voice no longer knife-sharp but still hard as steel. Stay here under my protection until you heal, or go back out there and die within 72 hours. Salvatore knows your face now. They never leave witnesses. Eleanor thought of the Toyota beneath the I-90 overpass, thought of the hickory stick, thought of 9 years surviving on instinct and will alone. Then she thought of Richard Cole, a man still living in Chicago, still breathing the same air she did, a man she had sworn would pay. She couldn't die yet. Not now. I'm not your dog, she said. No, he replied, standing and buttoning his suit jacket. You're not. Then he left the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the silence, the scent of lavender, and the sense that she had just stepped into a world whose rules she didn't understand. 3 days later, Eleanor was able to walk again, though each step still carried a dull ache along her ribs. She explored the Ashford mansion like a thief casing a target, memorizing every corridor, every doorway, every security camera. 9 years of street survival didn't fade easily. The estate was absurdly vast. 12 bedrooms, a 2-story library, a wine cellar stocked with bottles likely worth more than an apartment, a safe room with steel doors nearly 8 inches thick and its own ventilation system. Guards were posted at every gate, every hallway, every blind corner, beautiful like a museum and cold like a tomb. Eleanor felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage, the only difference being silk sheets and a private chef. She found the library on the 3rd afternoon, a massive room with soaring ceilings and oak shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. Late sunlight filtered through stained glass, scattering bands of color across the polished wood floor. Eleanor stood there, fingers brushing book spines, feeling strange touching something beautiful without being chased away. She likes to read. The voice made Eleanor turn. Ethan stood in the doorway, holding a thick book and a bag of Oreos. He wore jeans and a navy hoodie, looking far more ordinary than in the expensive uniform that day. My mom, he added as he stepped inside. She used to read to me before bed. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. She wasn't good with children, wasn't good with people at all if she was honest, but she recognized the look in his eyes, the look of a lonely child reaching for connection, and she didn't have the heart to turn away. What did she like to read? Eleanor asked. Ethan walked to the armchair by the window and sat as if it were his usual place. He lifted the book, The Count of Monte Cristo. Eleanor recognized the cover. She'd read it years ago in a public library, the story of betrayal and a revenge that consumed a lifetime. Strangely fitting. You read by yourself? She asked. Ethan shrugged. Dad's always busy. And Mom's not here anymore. Silence settled. Eleanor took the chair opposite him, keeping a careful distance, but close enough that he wouldn't feel pushed away. She didn't ask about his mother. She knew the rule. Don't probe wounds that haven't healed. But Ethan spoke anyway. She died 5 years ago, a car accident. His voice was flat, like reading a weather report. The way he said accident carried no certainty, no acceptance. Only the quiet doubt of a child who had learned early that adults lie. Eleanor looked at him, at the gray eyes just like his father's but clearer, sadder, and she understood. He didn't believe it was an accident. He knew there was more, and he'd lived with that unspoken truth for 5 years. Oreo? Ethan asked, opening the bag as if talking about his mother's death were the most ordinary thing in the world. Eleanor took one, not because she was hungry, but because she understood it was his way of reaching out. 2 lonely people sat in a room full of books, sharing cookies in silence, and nothing more needed to be said. Later that afternoon, after Ethan had gone back to his room, Eleanor sought out Griffin Hayes. Jonathan's lieutenant was a man in his 40s with a face carved from stone. No wasted expressions, no unnecessary movement. He regarded her with caution, but not hostility. The respect reserved for someone who had saved his employer's son. I need a favor, Eleanor said. Griffin didn't ask why. He simply waited. Richard Cole, CEO of Cole Development Group in Naperville. I need everything you have on him. Griffin raised an eyebrow but made no comment. 2 days later, the report lay on the table in her room. Eleanor read it alone, in the dark, bile rising in her throat. Richard Cole, 62 years old, CEO of Cole Development Group, specializing in commercial real estate, a generous donor to children's charities, board member of 3 schools, recipient of last year's Naperville Citizen of the Year award, and on the final page, the part Griffin had marked in red ink, Cole Development Group maintained financial transactions with both the Ashford Syndicate and the Salvatore family. Money laundering through construction projects, playing both sides, loyal to no one but himself. Eleanor stared at the name on the page until her vision blurred. The man who killed Molly was laundering money for the people she now lived among. The man who had touched her foster sister until an 8-year-old decided death was kinder than living was profiting from the underworld she had just stumbled into. She should tell Jonathan. She knew that, but she also knew Richard Cole was hers. 9 years of waiting. 9 years of sharpening the hickory stick and swearing she'd find a way. She wouldn't let anyone else steal her revenge. Not yet. Eleanor folded the report, hid it beneath her mattress, and looked out the window where the moon hung over Lake Michigan like a vast silver eye. 2 weeks passed in the strange rhythm of her new life. Eleanor woke each morning before dawn, when mist from Lake Michigan still draped the lawn behind the estate like a vast white veil. She went into the garden with the hickory stick, the only thing that truly belonged to her in this foreign world, and she trained. 50 slashes, 50 blocks, 50 thrusts. Her body still ached where Victor had cut her. Her ribs still flared with pain whenever she twisted too quickly. But Eleanor didn't stop. Pain was an old companion. She knew how to live with it. That morning, as she finished her final set, she felt someone watching her. Eleanor didn't turn around, but she knew. 9 years on the streets had taught her how to sense a gaze. She completed the exercise, wiped sweat from her face with her sleeve, and looked up at the second-floor window. Jonathan stood there, a cup of coffee in his hand, his face unreadable. He didn't wave, didn't nod, simply watched her like a scientist studying a rare specimen. Eleanor didn't know how long he'd been standing there. That afternoon, Griffin found her in the library where she was reading with Ethan. He waited until the boy left before speaking. "Mr. Ashford wants me to train you," Griffin said, his voice stripped of emotion. "Train me for what? To fight. To really fight. Not what you taught yourself from YouTube." Eleanor frowned. "I survived 9 years with what I taught myself." "You survived," Griffin nodded. "But next time you might need to win." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had seen too many battlefields to be impressed by stubbornness. "What you have isn't technique. It's survival instinct. Useful, but not enough. Instinct keeps you alive when you're attacked. Technique lets you strike first." Eleanor thought of Victor Romano, thought of the blade cutting into her flesh, thought of the helplessness when he grabbed her hair and she couldn't stop him. "Fine," she said. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow." 5 in the morning, Griffin replied, then turned and walked away without another word. That night, the nightmare came. Eleanor was standing in the bathroom in Naperville, cold water pooling around her ankles, and Molly lay in the tub. But this time the child wasn't still. This time Molly turned her head, eyes wide, blue as a summer sky, and spoke. "You didn't save me." Her voice was clear like wind chimes. "You let me die." Eleanor reached out, but the distance never closed. The bathtub kept drifting farther away, and Molly's voice echoed. "You let me die. You let me die. You let me die." Eleanor jolted awake with a scream tearing from her throat. Her hand grabbed the stick before she realized what she was doing, swinging it and shattering the bedside lamp. Glass exploded outward. Darkness swallowed the room. She sat there gasping, soaked in sweat, her heart hammering as if it would break through her chest. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. The door opened. Jonathan stood in the doorway, light from the hall forming a halo behind him. He didn't ask if she was all right, didn't ask what happened, didn't turn on the light, didn't call a doctor, didn't do any of the things Eleanor thought a normal person would do. He simply stepped inside, closed the door, and sat in the chair by the window in the dark. Silence stretched. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Eleanor heard his steady breathing, felt his non-intrusive presence, and slowly, her heartbeat eased. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said into the darkness, his voice low and distant, as if speaking more to himself than to her. She laughed too loudly and burned everything she tried to cook. She sang off-key and never remembered to turn off the lights when she left a room. Silence. "Salvatore planted a bomb in her car because I refused to give up Southside territory. Ethan was supposed to be in the car that day. She had dropped him at school 10 minutes before the bomb went off." Eleanor looked at his dark outline by the window, moonlight tracing a silver edge along his shoulders. "I don't sleep much," Jonathan said. Every time I close my eyes, I see the car on fire. Silence lingered. Then Eleanor heard her own voice, hoarse and breaking at the edges, speaking words she had never said aloud. Her name was Molly, she whispered. My foster sister. 8 years old. She told him about the blonde hair, the dandelion crowns, the song Molly sang every morning, about Richard Cole and the way he looked at her, about the bathtub and the empty pill bottle, about her screams that no one heard, about the vow she made on her first night beneath the overpass. For the first time in 9 years, Eleanor said everything, and Jonathan sat there in the dark, without judgment, without comfort, simply listening. Two wounded souls, sitting together in the night, sharing their ghosts. 1 month of training with Griffin changed Eleanor in ways she hadn't expected. Her body was still lean, but now it was the taut leanness of a drawn bow, every muscle clearly defined beneath the skin. She moved differently, no longer constantly curled into the defensive posture of a cornered animal, but with more confidence, more danger, like a hunter instead of prey. But nothing could have prepared her for tonight. The charity gala at the Ashford estate, an annual event Jonathan hosted to disguise business meetings with partners who never appeared on official paperwork. She'd tried to refuse, but Jonathan had insisted, saying she needed to be introduced as someone under Ashford protection, so Salvatore would know she was untouchable. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her room and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The black gown brushed the floor, simple yet perfectly tailored, the kind of dress she wouldn't have dared glance at through a shop window a month ago. Helena Price, Jonathan's lawyer and advisor, had chosen it for her. No jewelry except a pair of small pearl earrings. Her auburn hair was swept up, exposing the curve of her neck and the faint scar left by Victor's blade, a scar she'd refused to hide. No makeup beyond a little concealer for bruises not fully healed. And on her right thigh, hidden beneath the fabric, a folding knife in a leather sheath Helena had taught her to use. She descended the grand staircase, feeling like an imposter among men in tuxedos and women in diamonds. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light. Soft jazz drifted from a live band in the corner. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, the sound of money and power congratulating itself. Eleanor accepted a champagne flute from a passing server, more to have something in her hand than because she wanted to drink. She stood near a column, watching, trying to blend into the background as she had done for 9 years on the streets. Then she saw him. Richard Cole entered the room as if he owned it, even though it wasn't his house. Older than she remembered, his hair now fully white instead of salt and pepper, deeper lines around his eyes and mouth. But some things hadn't changed. The eyes, predator's eyes, cold and calculating, sweeping the room as if assessing every person. The way he stood, confident to the point of arrogance, as if law and morality were things meant for other people. Eleanor went still, the champagne flute suddenly heavy as lead in her hand. 9 years. 9 years she'd imagined this moment, planned it, discarded hundreds of scenarios. And now he stood there, less than 30 feet away, smiling at a portly businessman, as if he weren't a killer. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. 9 years and malnutrition had changed her too much. She was no longer the skinny 18-year-old with long, unkempt hair and fear in her eyes. But she recognized him. Every detail, every wrinkle, every gesture. Richard Cole moved through the crowd, shaking hands, nodding, then stopped beside a young female server. The girl looked about 20, blonde hair pulled into a ponytail, holding a tray of champagne. Cole said something. The girl smiled with the polite smile servers give customers, and then Eleanor saw it. Cole's smile. That smile, the one he'd given Molly when no one was watching. The smile of a predator choosing prey. Eleanor's hand tightened around the glass. Tighter, tighter still, until she heard a faint crack, glass fracturing under pressure, and a drop of blood slid from her finger. Not here. A familiar voice at her ear, low and close. The warmth of another body just behind her. Not tonight. Eleanor didn't turn, but she knew Jonathan stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his breath stir her hair. His hand gently took the cracked flute from her grip, replacing it with a white handkerchief for her to press to the cut. He knows, Eleanor realized. He'd read Griffin's report. He knew who Richard Cole was and what he meant to her. He'll pay, Eleanor whispered, her voice like a blade against stone. He will, Jonathan replied, his tone steady as steel. But not like this. Not tonight. We'll deal with him. Together. Eleanor turned, for the first time meeting Jonathan's gaze at a distance close enough to see the early silver at his temples and the diagonal scar on his face as clear as a map. Why? She asked. Why do you care? Jonathan didn't answer right away. He simply looked at her, and there was something in those gray eyes Eleanor couldn't name. Not pity, not calculation, but something deeper. Something like understanding. "Because some men deserve to pay," he said at last. "And because you shouldn't have to do it alone." 3 days after the party, the intelligence came in. Griffin called an emergency meeting in Jonathan's office, attended only by those closest to him, Helena Price, Tony Marchetti, who oversaw security, and unexpectedly, Eleanor as well. She didn't ask why she had been invited. She simply took a seat in the corner, watching and listening the way she had done for 9 years on the streets. "Salvatore is preparing something big," Griffin said, his voice stretched tight as a drawn wire. "Our sources say they're consolidating forces, but we don't know the exact target. And worse, we have a mole inside." Heavy silence fell. Jonathan said nothing. Seated behind his desk, fingers tapping lightly against the wood, gray eyes cold as ice. The meeting dragged on for 2 hours, covering security protocols, personnel reviews, increased protection for Ethan. But no one identified the traitor. Eleanor didn't speak once during the meeting. She just watched. And she realized. Over the next days, she observed quietly, using street survival instincts no one in this polished world possessed. She noticed Marcus, one of the guards hired 3 months earlier. He didn't behave incorrectly, but something was off. The way he checked his phone too often, always turning his back to the wall when he did. The way he avoided meeting Jonathan's eyes, not out of fear but guilt. The way he knew things a normal guard shouldn't, like Ethan's schedule or meetings with key partners. On the 4th night, Eleanor followed Marcus when his shift ended. He didn't go home. He went to the underground parking garage of an abandoned shopping center on the outskirts. She hid behind a concrete pillar and watched him pull out a second phone, a disposable burner, impossible to trace, and call someone. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she didn't need to. She'd seen enough. The next morning, Eleanor knocked on Jonathan's office door. He sat behind his desk reviewing a stack of papers but looked up when she entered. "Marcus," she said, without preamble. "He's using a burner phone to contact someone. Last night, the parking garage at the old Lincoln Mall." Jonathan didn't ask how she knew. Didn't ask if she was sure. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." Eleanor turned to leave but paused at the door. "What will you do with him?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. When he spoke, his voice was flat as a frozen lake. "Do you really want to know?" Eleanor thought of 9 years on the streets, thought of the things she'd seen, the things she'd done to survive. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't need to know." She left, and never asked about Marcus again. 2 days later, he vanished as if he had never existed. Tuesday morning began like every other Tuesday morning. Eleanor woke at 5, trained with Griffin in the basement gym, ate breakfast alone in the kitchen while the rest of the house still slept. Ethan had left for school at 7 with a newly reinforced security detail after the Marcus incident. Everything seemed normal. Until 9:23, Eleanor was in the library, partway through the book Ethan had recommended, when she heard something shatter from Jonathan's office. Not the sound of a dropped cup or broken plate. This was heavier, more violent, accompanied by the roar of a wounded animal. She reached the office, before Griffin did. Jonathan stood in the center of the room with his back to the door, shoulders trembling. On the opposite wall, a deep dent marked where a phone had been thrown, fragments scattered across the floor. Griffin burst in moments after Eleanor, gun already drawn. "Boss?" Jonathan turned, and Eleanor saw something she had never seen on his face before. Fear. Not the fear of a weak man, but the fear of a father about to lose the only thing that still mattered. His gray eyes churned like a storm. His jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped beneath the skin, and in his hand was another phone, the screen displaying a photograph. Ethan, tape over his mouth, eyes wide with terror, a stranger's hand gripping his hair and forcing his head back. Beneath the image was a message. "We have your son. Again. This time we won't be careless. Mr. Ashford, alone, back of the yard's warehouse district. 10 tonight. Bring weapons. The boy dies. Bring people. The boy dies. Don't come. You know what happens." Griffin swore, already reaching for his private phone to mobilize men. Jonathan stopped him. "No. Boss, this is an obvious trap. They'll kill you the moment you walk in." "I know. Then we need a plan. Call everyone. Surround the area first. And let them kill Ethan the second they see our vehicles nearby." Jonathan roared, his voice splintering at the edges like cracked glass. My son is in those bastards' hands. My son. He slammed his fist into the wall, blood seeping from his knuckles, but he didn't stop. Again, until Griffin grabbed him. Boss, calm down. We'll figure something out. Eleanor had stood still the entire time, her mind processing at the speed 9 years on the streets had trained into her. An obvious trap. Salvatore knew Jonathan would come. They'd have men waiting at every corner, every entrance. The moment Jonathan stepped inside, he'd be dead. But there was one thing they hadn't accounted for. She stepped forward. "They're waiting for you," Eleanor said, her voice unnervingly calm amid the chaos. "They're not waiting for me." Jonathan lifted his head, looking at her as if he'd only just realized she was there. "No." His voice hardened like steel. "They think I'm who?" she continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "The stray cat you took in? A charity case. Nobody important. They don't know I've been trained. They don't know what I can do." "No," Jonathan repeated, moving toward her. "I won't let you die for my son." Eleanor didn't step back. She met his gaze, standing close enough to see the vein pulsing at his temple and the pain tearing him apart from the inside. "Do you want to save your son, or do you want to protect your pride?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp as a blade. "Choose." Silence stretched. Griffin looked between them, not daring to intervene. Jonathan stared at Eleanor, jaw locked, eyes raging. Then he closed his eyes, drew a deep breath, and when he opened them, the fury was reined in, replaced by something colder, more calculating, more dangerous. "What's your plan?" Night swallowed Chicago in a thick black shroud as Eleanor slipped down into the sewer opening at the corner of 47th and Ashland. The stench rose like an invisible wall, cold wastewater lapping at her ankles, but she didn't hesitate. 9 years on the streets had taught her that darkness was a friend if you knew how to use it, and the places others feared were often the safest. The hickory stick was strapped diagonally across her back, the folding knife hidden in her boot, nothing else but black clothes and iron will. She moved through the underground system using the map Griffin had provided, counting steps and turns until she reached the access point directly behind the abandoned meatpacking plant Salvatore was using to hold Ethan. Eleanor eased the manhole cover up just enough to see. The yard behind the factory lay in darkness, lit only by a single flickering bulb above the back door. 2 men stood guard, guns tucked into their waistbands, smoking and talking in low voices. They never imagined the threat would come from beneath their feet. She waited, patient the way she had waited for 9 years. One of them flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushed it under his heel, then turned toward the shadows to relieve himself. That moment was all Eleanor needed. She rose from the sewer like a ghost from the earth, silent. The remaining guard didn't have time to register danger before the stick came down, striking the base of his skull with the precision Griffin had drilled into her. Not hard enough to kill, just enough to drop him like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. The second man turned at the sound, hand reaching for his gun, but Eleanor was already there. She pivoted, swept the stick into his knee, and as he collapsed, she struck his temple. 2 men, 10 seconds. No gunfire, no screams, no alarm. She dragged both into the brush, bound them with the plastic ties Griffin had given her, stuffed rags into their mouths, then slipped inside through the back door they had left unsecured. Inside, the factory was a maze of rusted machinery and shadow. Eleanor moved like breath itself, each step feather light, back to the wall, eyes clearing every blind corner. She heard voices above, saw light spilling from a second-floor office window. She climbed the rear stairs 1 step at a time, avoiding rotted boards that might creak. The office door was frosted glass. 2 adult silhouettes moving inside, and a smaller one sitting motionless in a chair. "Ethan." Eleanor waited. One of the guards said something, snorted a laugh, then stepped out, likely for the restroom or food. 1 left. She pushed the door open just enough to slip through. The remaining guard stood with his back turned, staring out the window, unaware death was behind him. She didn't give him the chance to turn. The stick cracked against the back of his head and he dropped face first to the floor, unconscious instantly. Eleanor stepped over him and went to Ethan. The boy sat bound to the chair, hands tied behind him with rope, tape over his mouth, but his gray eyes lit up when he saw her. She peeled the tape away as gently as she could and cut the ropes with the knife. "Miss Ellie," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking but steady, not crying. "I knew you'd come." Eleanor pulled him into a brief embrace, felt the small body trembling in her arms, then let go. "Shh, we're not out yet." Eleanor clasped Ethan's hand and led him through the maze of rusted machinery and shadow. Backstairs, long corridor, Left turn, right turn. She had memorized the path on the way in, and now replayed it in reverse inside her mind. The exit was only 20 feet away. She could see moonlight slipping through the gap in the steel door, could smell the air of freedom. Then a dark shape stepped into their path. Victor Romano stood there as if he'd been waiting for her all along. The wound from Jonathan's bullet had healed, leaving a new scar on his right shoulder, added to the collection of scars on a face twisted by hatred. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him. No longer the smug confidence of a man in control, but the cold fury of someone humiliated and starving for revenge. "You homeless bitch," Victor said, his voice like gravel grinding in his throat. "I knew you'd come. Ashford's too weak to dirty his own hands, so he sent his dog." He held a hunting knife, the serrated blade glinting in moonlight filtering through the broken roof. A knife designed not just to stab, but to tear, to maximize pain. Eleanor pushed Ethan behind her, the hickory stick already in her hand. "Ethan," she said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered. "Run. Out the back door. Find the green van. Griffin's waiting outside." "But Miss Ellie." "Run." Ethan ran. He slipped through the narrow space between Eleanor and the wall, small feet slapping the concrete, and vanished into the darkness toward the back exit. Victor didn't chase him. He didn't care about the boy anymore. He only wanted her. "Last time you got lucky," Victor said as he advanced, the knife spinning in his hand like a toy. "This time there's no Ashford to save you. Just you and me." Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't waste breath on words when she needed it to stay alive. She recalled the month of training with Griffin, every lesson, every technique, every fall, and every time she'd gotten back up. She wasn't prey anymore. Victor struck first. He was fast. Faster than she remembered. Faster than anyone she'd ever faced. The blade slashed down toward her neck. Eleanor dodged left, raised the stick to block, wood crashing against steel with a ringing clang. He didn't stop. Thrust, slash, kick, a relentless chain of attacks that gave her no time to breathe. Eleanor retreated, blocked, slipped aside, retreated again. He was stronger than her, faster than her, years of combat experience against 1 month of training. But she had something he didn't. She had a reason to live. When Victor lunged again, she didn't dodge. She stepped inside the attack, accepted the blade cutting into her left forearm, pain flaring like fire, but gained the distance she needed. The stick slammed into his ribs with all the force she had. Bone cracked. Victor roared and staggered, his hand going to the gun at his waist. Eleanor didn't let him aim. The stick snapped into his wrist, the gun flying free, skidding across the concrete and vanishing into the dark. Victor slashed wildly, pain and rage stripping away control. Eleanor read every movement, a month of training turning survival instinct into real combat skill. She waited for the thrust, stepped aside, and brought the stick down on his knee with a crack like a branch breaking. Victor collapsed, screaming in agony, still clawing at the knife but unable to stand. Eleanor stood over him, the stick raised high, ready for the final blow to his head that would end everything. One strike, just one, and the man who'd tortured her, who'd tried to take Ethan, who'd nearly killed her, would never hurt anyone again. Victor looked up, blood spilling from the corner of his mouth, and he smiled, a twisted, mad, defiant smile. "Do it," he rasped. "Prove you're just like us. Prove you're a monster too." Eleanor looked down at him, at the dead fish eyes, at the scarred face, at everything cruel and violent he represented. She thought of Molly, thought of her vow, thought of Ethan running toward freedom. Then she lowered the stick. "No," she said, her voice calm as still water. "I'm not like you." She turned and walked away, leaving Victor screaming behind her in helpless pain, moving toward the door where moonlight waited. 1 week passed in the rhythm of recovery. The cut on Eleanor's forearm had taken 12 stitches. Her old ribs ached again when the weather shifted. But she didn't care about the wounds on her body. She was waiting for something far more important. Jonathan had promised. And Jonathan Ashford was a man who kept his word. On Thursday morning, Griffin knocked on her door. "Mr. Ashford wants to see you in the private conference room, basement level." Eleanor knew what it meant before she ever reached the stairs. Jonathan's private meeting room was unlike any conference room Eleanor had ever seen. No windows, soundproofed walls, a long table of dark oak and leather chairs, the kind of room where decisions that never made it into records were decided. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, Griffin at his right, and in the center of the room, seated alone, was Richard Cole. He looked older than she remembered, as if the past week had stripped 10 years from him. His gray suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked, silver hair disheveled as though he hadn't slept in days. When Eleanor entered, Richard lifted his head, and she saw the moment of recognition cross his face. First confusion, then doubt, then memory crashing back like a tidal wave. His face drained of color. "Eleanor?" His voice shook. "Little Eleanor?" Eleanor stood across from him, 3 feet away, close enough to see every wrinkle on the face of the man who had destroyed her sister's life, close enough to see sweat bead on his forehead despite the winter cold of the room. "I'm not a little girl anymore, Richard," she said, her voice flat as frozen water. "I grew up, I survived, and I never forgot." Richard turned to Jonathan, searching for rescue, grasping for any business leverage he still believed he had. "Mr. Ashford, I don't understand what's happening. This girl is mentally unstable. She ran away from my house years ago, and Jonathan cut him off." He set a thick folder on the table directly in front of Richard, the sound of paper striking wood like a judge's gavel. "Inside this file is evidence of your money laundering through Cole Development Group," Jonathan said, his voice like steel ground on stone. "Transactions with both the Ashford Syndicate and the Salvatore family, enough to put you in prison for 30 years on financial charges alone." Richard opened his mouth, but Jonathan continued. "And here's the more interesting part." He flipped to the next page. "Sworn testimony from 3 other children who once lived in your home, now grown, now ready to tell the truth. Identical stories, Richard. Identical to what you did to Molly." Richard trembled, gripping the arms of the chair as if afraid he might fall. "They're lies. All lies." "I never." Eleanor stepped forward 1 pace, and Richard fell silent as if strangled. "Molly was 8 years old," she said, each word fired like a bullet. "You touched her until she couldn't live with it anymore. You killed my sister not with your hands, but worse than that. You made her kill herself." Silence. Richard looked at Eleanor, at Jonathan, at Griffin, standing like a statue with his hand resting on his weapon. He understood there was no escape. "You have 2 choices," Jonathan said. "First, tomorrow morning you walk into the FBI and confess everything. Financial crimes and abuse. You go to prison, and with what inmates do to men like you, you'll likely die there. But at least you die quietly." Richard swallowed. "And the second choice? We send everything to the press tonight. Your name will be on every front page, every news channel, every social platform. Your family, your friends, your partners will all know exactly what you are. Then you still go to prison, but the world watches you rot." Silence stretched. Richard Cole, successful executive, model citizen, predator wearing a human face, sat with slumped shoulders and dead eyes. "I choose the first option," he whispered at last. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, waiting for satisfaction, for triumph, for something to repay 9 years of pain. But what she felt wasn't that, only emptiness, and beneath it, a small, quiet peace. Molly was still gone. Nothing could change that. But at least the man who destroyed her would pay. Eleanor turned and walked out of the room without looking back. 6 months could change a person more than Eleanor had ever thought possible. She sat on the back porch of the Ashford estate, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching Ethan run across the lawn with Scout. The German shepherd Jonathan had brought home 3 months earlier. The boy threw a tennis ball. The dog sprinted after it like an arrow, then raced back with its tail wagging wildly and its tongue lolling in pure happiness. Ethan laughed, a clear, ringing sound that filled the garden, a laugh Eleanor had once believed he'd forgotten how to make. Leaves had turned across the 20-acre property, gold and red and orange, Illinois autumn in all its blazing beauty. The cool air carried the scent of damp leaves and ripe apples from the orchard along the side of the house. Eleanor drew a deep breath and felt something she hadn't believed she'd ever feel again after 9 years on the streets: peace. She had her own room on the 2nd floor, across from Ethan's, a real bed with silk sheets and a quilt, not the back seat of a car or a park bench, a closet full of clothes that fit, not donations pulled from a bin, a desk by the window where she sat every night, studying for the GED exam she'd take next month. Math still made her want to bang her head against the wall, but she'd survived far worse. Every morning, she still woke at 5 to train with Griffin, no longer out of fear but because it had become habit, part of who she was. Every afternoon, she sat in the library with Ethan, reading or simply sharing silence, 2 people who'd once been alone no longer alone. The sound of a car engine pulled her from her thoughts. Jonathan's Mercedes rolled to a stop in front of the house, and he stepped out carrying 2 grocery bags. No 3-piece Tom Ford suit, just jeans and a gray sweater. looking more like a suburban dad back from the store than the most powerful crime boss in Chicago. "Dad." Ethan ran toward him, Scout barking happily at his heels. Jonathan set the bags down just in time to catch the boy, arms wrapping tight. And in that moment, Eleanor saw something she'd been seeing more and more over the past 6 months. Family. Strange, unconventional, built on blood and violence and shared pain, but family all the same. That night, after dinner, Eleanor had learned to cook from the estate's chef. Jonathan called her into his office. She stepped inside, and the first thing she saw was her hickory stick mounted on the wall like a work of art, framed in glass with soft lighting. A small plaque beneath it she couldn't read from where she stood. "Your old stick," Jonathan said, standing beside the wall. "I thought it deserved to be displayed. It saved my son's life. Twice." Eleanor stepped closer and read the inscription on the plaque. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Jonathan crossed to a display cabinet in the corner, opened it, and took out a long object wrapped in black velvet. "But I also thought you needed a new one." He pulled back the cloth, and Eleanor stopped breathing. The new stick was slightly longer than the old one, the hickory polished until it reflected the light like a mirror. The balance looked perfect, something she could sense just by looking, and carved deep into the handle were 2 letters, E-A. Eleanor looked up, meeting Jonathan's gray eyes. "That's a pretty bold assumption," she said, her voice not entirely steady. Jonathan set the stick on the desk, then took out a small box, smaller than the palm of his hand. The kind of box Eleanor had seen in movies but never imagined she'd see in real life. He opened it. Inside was a ring, white gold, simple, with a small diamond. Not the oversized kind wealthy people like to show off, just a single stone that caught the light quietly, elegant and practical, like the woman it was meant for. "I'm not good at saying things like this," Jonathan said, his voice lower than usual. "I've lived in the dark too long. I forgot how to say the normal things normal people say. But you changed that. You changed everything." He looked at her, his gray eyes no longer cold as steel but warmer now, softer, like ice melting in sunlight. "I'm not asking you to be a Mafia wife. I'm asking you to be family. Officially, to be Ethan's mother, to be the person I come home to every night, to be the person I want to protect until my last breath." Eleanor looked at the ring, looked at the new stick with her initials carved into the handle, looked at the man in front of her. The man who'd given her everything she'd never dared to dream of. The man who'd kept his promises, who'd looked at her as if she mattered when the world had thrown her away. "Yes," she said. Just one word. No speech, no tears. Just a single word carrying everything. Jonathan slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been measured in advance. Of course it fit. He was Jonathan Ashford. He knew everything. Eleanor looked at the small diamond catching the light, then at the new stick with E-A carved into the handle, then at the man standing before her, his gray eyes warmer than she'd ever seen them. She didn't cry. She wasn't the kind of person who cried in moments like this. She simply nodded, once more, confirming the answer she'd already given. Outside, car engines were starting. The convoy was preparing for the weekly territory patrol, a routine Eleanor had grown used to over the past 6 months. Jonathan turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "You coming with me?" Eleanor picked up the new stick, feeling its perfect weight in her hand, the smooth hickory beneath her palm. She followed him outside. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in streaks of gold and orange and red, like a canvas brushed with fire. The line of glossy black Mercedes waited along the driveway, men in dark suits standing by, Griffin giving her a nod when he saw her. Eleanor paused for a moment, taking it all in. The estate that had become home. The second-floor window where Ethan waved, Scout bouncing beside him, the ring on her finger and the stick in her hand. 6 months earlier, she'd been nobody. A homeless girl sleeping in an abandoned car, surviving one day at a time on sheer will and a promise to a dead sister. She'd had nothing but a wooden stick and a refusal to surrender. Now she had everything, but not because someone had handed it to her, not because she'd been rescued like a princess from a fairy tale. She wasn't a princess. She was a warrior. And she'd fought for every single thing she had, every scar, every sleepless night, every blow taken, and every time she'd stood back up. She'd earned her place with blood and sweat, and a resilience no one could ever take away. Eleanor stepped into the car beside Jonathan, the stick resting across her lap, the ring glinting on her finger. The convoy rolled forward, heading toward a city sinking into twilight. The girl who'd had nothing had found everything, and she was ready for whatever came next. Eleanor's story reminds us that the past doesn't define the future, that hardship isn't an ending but a beginning for inner strength. Sometimes the people the world casts aside are the ones with the fiercest hearts, and love can come from the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share this video so more people can hear inspiring stories like this every day. How did Eleanor's story make you feel? Did she remind you of someone in your own life? Share what's in your heart in the comments below. We'd truly love to hear from you. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.